Welcome everyone to our Frederick Douglass series lecture. And I just want to first of all, on behalf of President Lieberman and Provost Genoyan, to say welcome, to also welcome Kara Stevens. This is a University of Laverne College of Arts and Sciences and Title V Skills for Success Grant co-sponsored event. And we decided this year that in follow-up to last year's discussion on education, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we would focus our attention to human rights as it pertains to economic well-being. And so that is why we have elected the speaker this year as Kara Stevens. So with that said, let me give a brief introduction and then I'll give the floor over to our wonderful speaker. Kara Stevens is the author of The Unmasking the Strong Black Woman, Heal Your Relationship with Money, and The Happy Finances Challenge. Her sound yet relatable advice has been featured in respected media outlets, including CNBC, The Huffington Post, and Sweet July, Black Enterprise, Business Insiders, Essence, and Ebony, just to name a few. She is also a sought-after speaker lecturing on the power of owning your personal finance story, healing your relationship with money, and mastering healthy money habits. Her message of financial self-awareness has been widely received across college campuses around the country. Most recently, she launched Abundance and Overflow, a private wealth and wellness membership community for women who want to learn how to achieve financial and spiritual and emotional freedom. She is the founder of the Frugal Feminista, which is a site that empowers women with regard to financial wellness. She is a native New Yorker and first-generation American via the beautiful island of Antigua. She possesses a BA in political science from Oberlin College, an MS Ed degree in bilingual education from SUNY's, and that's SUNY's with a C, not an S, Hunter's College, and an Ed.M. degree in organizational leadership from Columbia University's Teachers College. We are so excited to hear today from such a wonderful speaker. I introduce to you Kara Stevens.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you all that are taking your time to be here today. It's 3 o'clock in New York. It's 12 o'clock where you guys are. So it's still the afternoon. So thank you for that. So this afternoon, we'll be talking about the economic and emotional power of we in the time of COVID. As I was preparing for this lecture, I couldn't help but do a trip down memory lane and think of my alma mater, Oberlin, and my first day at school. My mom was a single mom from the beautiful yet small island of Antigua in the West Indies. And in all of her years in living in England and working as a midwife, and then emigrating to the US and taking up residence in New York City, this world traveler out of necessity never learned how to drive. So she had to convince a pastor friend who was kind of sweet on her that God really wanted her to drive me, my luggage, and her 500 miles all the way from the boondocks of Queens, New York, to the even more obscure recesses of Oberlin, which, to underscore its smallness even more, was a town only created as a result of the college in 24 hours because my mom was reluctant to take a day off from work. This was not the coveted cross-country road trip to take as an American part of our rites of passage. No music blasting through the window as my braids gently obscured my sight while I daydreamed about the possibility of my future, or living in the moment and feeling the oneness with the world that is experienced by someone who always feels free, always feels powerful, and always feels assured of success. There was no dog as a best friend in the back seat to bark as if on cue when we shared a tender moment. No, it was not that kind of trip at all. It was a trip perhaps many of you had to take to get here and perhaps prepare a loved one for, where the decisions had nothing to do with emotion and all had to do with survival and your bottom line. Decisions were bare bone, white knuckled, born out of a stubborn pursuit and or belief. If you could just get the chosen one, which was you, to the door of their destinies, which was college. God, Jesucristo, Santa Maria, Allah, Jah, the universe, your ancestors, everybody, and luck would take care of the rest. Born in the belief that this sacrifice, this discomfort would translate into joy, wealth, and a better life, not just for the chosen one, but the ones that were betting on you to succeed, to lift the rest of us up. You know that narrative. It's the narrative that served as a salve to all the late nights, financial sacrifices, writing out of disappointments, and pushing forward sometimes only on fume, because it wasn't your win, it was our win. These were there are no plan B trips. I don't remember much conversation from the front passenger seat from my mom to me in the back seat throughout our 24-hour trip, which only allowed for a few hours of sleep in our nondescript motel and a solemn breakfast at an equally forgettable diner once we made it to Ohio. All I can remember from that trip, that there was only enough time for Father Bunna to lug my trunk all the way up 3 flights of stairs to my new dorm, my mom to kiss me on the cheek and cover her face from tears because before she headed downstairs to the rented car, so she wouldn't feel too indebted to the good father for his generosity. The next time my mom would set foot on campus would be 4 years later as she cried, but this time happy tears of relief. I was the baby of the family and her only daughter to graduate from a prestigious American college on time and not pregnant. That was a miracle to her, and that was in 2001. However, when I graduated, I met the world of adulting at the time of September 11th, without a job, a broken heart. My boyfriend had just dumped me, feeling utterless, with student loan debt, and back home living in my mama's house in my childhood bedroom, feeling perhaps that those 4 years on campus were in vain. But unlike you, I wasn't experiencing the normal angst and insecurity that comes with being a first-gen college student amidst a global pandemic that uniquely ravished and devastated our communities. A recent Stanford-led study found that Latinos living in California had a COVID case rate more than 3 times that of whites. And if you want the numbers, it's 3,784 versus 1,112 per 100,000 people. The death rate for Latinos was 1.55 times higher than white residents. Black people in California had the highest death rates among all of the racial and ethnic groups in that study. And just for this moment, I would like to take the time to acknowledge the names behind those numbers. These were and still are people that we love and want to honor in their memory. And I know the chat function is very different than that won't necessarily allow it. But if they can, or if you want to, please say the name of every family member and friend that you lost in this pandemic, and we'll take a moment of silence to honor them. Thank you. The reasons for this uneven devastation points to the structural inequalities that existed for decades in our society prior to the pandemic. We were already buckling under lower home ownership rates, lower retirement savings, ambivalence and mistrust of the healthcare system, lower college attainment, and less access to capital for small businesses. Prior to the pandemic, a typical median white family owned about $184,000 in family wealth. A typical Black family owned $23,000, and a typical Hispanic family owned $38,000. And for those of us like me who were raised by single family headed households, the numbers are stunning, but not in a good way. The historical legacy of the racial wealth gap in combination with the women's wealth gap left women of color with the least amount of wealth. Single Black women had a median wealth of $200, and single Hispanic women $100, less than a penny for every dollar of wealth owned by a single white non-Hispanic male. During the pandemic, things just got worse. We face more financial emergencies left by job losses, childcare costs, and/or higher healthcare costs, with fewer economic resources, resulting in a widening gap in economic opportunity between households in our communities, the Black and Latino ones, and white households. Black and Hispanic workers, specifically our moms, daughters, and aunts and sisters, were also overrepresented in essential jobs, which require them to work outside the house while others got to shelter in place, and often left less reliable social distancing regulations, fewer benefits, fewer opportunities for paid leave, and for notoriously low and arguably exploitative wages. We had to choose between our health and feeding our families and paying rent. The impact of COVID also took a toll on our civic lives. If you're Hispanic, you are more likely than your white American counterpart to have died of COVID before age 65, while you're in your prime, productive, and civically engaging years. In your own state, California, Latinos between the ages of 20 and 54 were 8.5 times more likely than their white Americans at that age range to die of COVID. Currently, GOP lawmakers have proposed at least 250 laws in 43 states across this country that would limit mail, early in-person, and election day voting with such constraints as stricter ID requirements, limited hours, or more narrow eligibility to vote absentee. With fewer Latinos around to vote, these aggressive and blatant attacks on voting rights that disproportionately silence the voices of students like you, persons with disabilities, low income, and African Americans who vote overwhelmingly Democratic have a greater chance to erode our democracy. As you already know, democracies are strongest when everyone participates, not just the few and the powerful, and not for those who weaponize their wealth and influence. As we grapple with the effects of COVID in our families and households, environmental racism hasn't stopped. It hasn't stopped killing and sickening our families, our mothers and our fathers, our aunts and our uncles and our brothers and our sisters. EPA's National Center for Environmental Assessments released a study saying that people of color, meaning us, are much more likely to live near polluters and breathe polluted air. It found that our overall levels of particulate matter exposure were higher than those of white people and linked this exposure to several lung conditions, heart attacks, possible premature deaths, asthma prevalence and severity, low birth weights, and high blood pressure. And finally, this pandemic has also spawned widespread mental health problems, if not exacerbating pre-existing ones. I had a friend text me at the top of the year saying something to the effect, "Dear 2020, you are so disrespectful and petty. You are doing the most. I want my money back. Call me when you get it together," right? It makes you laugh because you don't want to cry. And I know you can't have the chat function, but put a $sign in the chat if you want your money back from 2021, 2022, and I'm assuming 2023. But who else feels that way, honestly? The US Census Bureau data confirms how you're feeling if you put a $sign in that chat, because 41% of US adults reported symptoms of anxiety and depressive disorders, compared to only 11% in 2019. They also found that Blacks and Latinos, as well as women, were more likely to report these symptoms. Financial worries, managing several children on remote learning, which I have one child, that was intense, while still working from home, and the social isolation many have experienced were their top concerns. So when you intimately are aware of these realities, and when then you see someone like Jeremy Haynes, a marketing CEO, say something on Twitter, if you don't come out of this quarantine with either a new skill or two, starting what you've been putting off, like a new business, or 3, more knowledge, you didn't ever lack the time, you lacked the discipline. Seriously? I can't help but get frustrated, to say the least. These statements come across as tone deaf, empirically unsound, out of touch, and reeking of privilege. The accompanying overtone of shame, an implied message that your worth is equated with what you produce, has no place in a global conversation when Black and Brown communities are bearing the burden and the brunt of loss, grief, anger, fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. During the era of COVID, you simultaneously had America's most public moral reckoning with its history of racism, violence, and brutality on Black lives and Black bodies. As a nation, we all saw before our eyes the murder of an innocent, harmless Black man who was not perfect and didn't have to be, but who also did not deserve to die that day in that way by members of our community that were there to protect and serve. That, coupled with the growing anti-Asian violence across this country, there was no way that our communities could go about as business as usual. I repeat, there was no way that our communities or the world could collectively go about business as usual. The minds, the bodies, souls, and wealth of Black and Brown people were under siege, and it was not business as usual. In this era of widespread trauma, we need to be in the business of self-care and community care, honestly. And I know the idea of rest seems antithetical to the big goals that you have for yourself. And if your immigrant family has told you about your assignment, which is to be the first to come to college and get out on time, that you only have one chance to get it right. But let me tell you, as a recovering perfectionist, first-gen American, first-gen college student, you have time when you create it, or the universe has a funny way of forcing you to make time when you're too busy, as my mom say, too busy being stubborn. When I was a teacher looking to be a school leader, I had a mentor who I was excited to learn from. This was a superintendent of my school district with years of experience. So I was expecting to learn all the secrets and all the things of climbing the educational leadership ladder, learning about educational reform, teacher development, and educational policy. But most of our conversations was about how I was feeling, managing my emotions, and how I was taking care of myself. What kind of human being did I want to be? And I was quite irritated because my sole purpose in life at that time was to be principal by 30 and make six figures and make my mom proud. That's it. After a while, I was convinced that this superintendent was teaching me all this woo-woo stuff because either he didn't really know anything or he just didn't want to share. But 10 years later, I fully understand. I more than understand, because my first year being an assistant principal, I had my first mental breakdown. It was Christmas break, and I was crying uncontrollably on my couch, burnt out and unable to function. I was so stressed that my locks had fallen out along the ridge and the edges, and getting up in the morning to bathe was a challenge. I eventually found a therapist that I saw once a week, every week for a year, and then off again and on again after that episode for mental health check-ins, and we were not in a pandemic. So if no one has validated your feelings, the pressures of being in college now, the pressures of being here while in the middle of a pandemic, and as our country searches for its soul and its center, let me be the first to say, you are doing the best that you can, and your best is enough. And if you've been feeling that you're not able to get back to an emotional place that feels safe and allows you to show up in the best way you can, please know that this is not the time to ignore your feelings and keep it pushing. Please know that you don't have to suffer in silence. There are resources on campus here for you to support. And here are just a few. The Office of Religious and Spiritual Life, the Center for Multicultural Services, the Lewis Center of Wellbeing and Research, counseling and psychological services, and any professor that you have a great relationship with can point you to other resources that may suit you. Because take it from me, a fellow child of an immigrant raised in a tradition of not opening up and keeping your head to the grind, there is no reward or trophy for martyrdom. And this is especially true for the young women who are watching this call, where some of our cultures hold us hostage to swallow pain and rewards deprivation, and leaving you and leaving yourself and your needs last. But let me tell you, you'll be no good to yourself or your future. And if it feels scary to make that first step alone, I encourage you to find a friend to accompany you or sit with you as you make the phone call or write out that email. But let me also tell you, as a personal finance person, I don't want you out here wasting your money. So take advantage of these resources because they're there for you and it's included in your tuition. I just have to put that out there. I also think that college is the best place to get good at self-care. Experiment with self-care practices, which include everything from pampering to simple routines of regular rest, quiet time in nature, prayer, massage, meditation, cooking, conversation with friends, exercise, music, and professional support like counseling or medication if you need it. And while you're here, this space also allows you to reimagine and expand your ideas around the concept of care, extending it to include community care and incorporate it into a new leadership framework that is equipped to address the many challenges affecting our lives as Black and Brown people. One positive outcome from the pandemic was that medical schools are reporting a record increase in Black students. Across the US, a number of first-year African Americans is on the way up, 21%, an unprecedented spike since 2020. But I want to ask you, how could we apply this to a different sector or here on campus? What else could this look like? What can we learn from this trend? And what role does cultural competence and community care play in the creation of public policy, which can actually begin on campus and addresses the needs of the most vulnerable? Back in the day, there was this guy named Rudy Lozano, a Mexican-American freedom fighter, a job rights activist, and an immigration rights activist in Chicago in the 1970s and 80s. He was also born in Texas, and he was responsible for the Black-Brown Coalition. He formed the Black-Brown Coalition in order to put a person of color in the alderman seats that had been occupied by white men. He would survey the communities to find a candidate that could run and put all of the power of the Black-Brown Coalition behind that candidate because individually there weren't enough Puerto Rican votes or Mexican votes, Black votes or white ally votes to win. He was responsible for flipping the seats in Chicago's city council, as well as getting Harold Washington, who you see here with him, as the first Black mayor in the city. In his memoir, President Barack Obama shares that he was drawn to politics and specifically Chicago because of Harold Washington. But if there were no Judy Lozano, there would be no Harold Washington, and by extension, President Obama. And we can thank a white woman, the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, also known as Notorious RGB. Now you guys know I'm East Coast, so I gotta give love, okay? But she was known for the intersectional work that she did for millions of disenfranchised women in the way she revolutionized women's finances. First, it was with employment and reproductive choices. Ginsburg founded and led the Women's Rights Project of the American Civil Rights Liberties Union, the ACLU, which pushed for systemic reform. Alongside attorney Susan Della Ross, Ginsburg fought and passed the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978. That act meant that women could not be discriminated against because they might be pregnant or might be pregnant, as if they were the only one getting themselves pregnant. It's crazy. It empowered women to earn their own money, build their own savings, and make their own investment choices. Another significant fight was against forced sterilization. In the 1970s, poor women, predominantly in the South, were told that they first must be sterilized to keep jobs. Ginsburg argued that women should be able to make those decisions for themselves. And who do you think the faces of those poor women resembled? People in your family? The same goes for equalizing access to college admissions for women. In 1996, women were prohibited from attending the state-supported Virginia Military Institute. But let me ask you a question. What year were you born? I bet it was close to 1996 and not too far. So imagine, how would that make you feel if in this state you were not allowed to attend just because of your gender? As a justice, Ginsburg was able to open the doors for female students, giving them the same educational opportunities as males. She argued as a justice that any law that denies women access simply because they are women, full citizenship stature, equal opportunity to aspire, achieve, and participate and contribute to society violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Without her, you would not be able to open up a credit to surprise yourself or your friends or your mom with something special, your first brokerage account, or your first car. Ginsburg's early work laid the foundation for the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. This act meant that you could open a bank account, take out credit cards as a woman in your own name, and commit to a mortgage without a male cosigner. The act makes it illegal for a creditor to discriminate against an applicant because of reasons of sex, race, color, marital status, age, or religion. It means finally, women can control their financial decisions, including buying a home or even taking out a personal loan. If you haven't noticed by now that there's a pattern that I've been talking about since the top of our call, it's that when there's smoke in Black folks' homes, there's fire in Latinos, and vice versa. If there's smoke in Latinos' homes, you can expect flames in Black folks' home, figuratively. But sometimes it doesn't seem as if we act like our fates are intertwined. Sometimes it's the fault of internalized colorism and racism as a result of European colonization throughout Central and Latin America, as well as American chattel slavery and the construct of race and racism that followed. Sometimes it's ignorance. But I argue there's an additional factor at play. It's a manufactured scarcity and a scramble for perceived limited resources that is used to pin communities of color against one another by those in power in our capitalist system. I remember when I was a sophomore in college, I had a roommate named Lisa. Lisa was Asian American. She was Korean American, to be specific. Lisa was extremely cool and we had a great relationship as roommates. That was until we attended a forum on funding for a program on campus. Black students wanted more courses in African American studies, and Asian students said it was time for Asian studies and more programs in the Asian studies departments because Black folk get everything. Lisa co-signed this thinking, but I was a sophomore. I was Black for sure, but I was also studying Japanese. It was my third year. I had went to high school, studied Japanese. So I was my third year studying Japanese freshman and sophomore year. And I was thinking about going to Japan. So I was actually fairly on the fence about where this money should go. But to defend my people, I was like, give the money to Black people. But how we view that as an opportunity for both groups to push the administration to find the money and solve the problem they created, perhaps Lisa and I would have had a different conversation and a different approach to thinking about unity, allyship early on as underclassmen. And perhaps our co-living situation would not have been so tense that week. You can say it loud. I'm Black and I'm proud, and still fight for immigration issues that negatively impact the Latinx community. It doesn't diminish your Blackness. You can be proud to be Latino and do it for La Raza and still be in solidarity for Black lives, Black matters, and all the things related to race and racism in this country, especially since there's an overlap in Black and Latinx in the Latin diaspora and what it means to be Latin and what it means to be Black. It doesn't compromise your Latin identity. The pandemic ravished us more or less equally. Structural inequalities disenfranchised us and destroyed us equally. Our struggles are the same, so our solutions require each other. We need each other to solve our problems right here on this campus and when we take our rightful spots as leaders in our community. History also shows what happens when we look away and when we don't support each other. Pastor Nemoiler, during the trials for the Holocaust, wrote, "First they came." He was initially an anti-Semitic Nazi supporter, but his views changed when he was imprisoned in a concentration camp for speaking out against Nazi controls of churches. And here's what he wrote. "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." I just want to let you know, guys, this is an exciting time for us to choose unity and joy and allyship, not for one, but for us all, just like in the parable of the long spoons. In this parable, the only difference between heaven and hell is that the people figured out that the only way for them to eat was to sit in a circle and use their spoons to feed one another across the way, rather than focus selfishly on themselves to use the long spoon to feed themselves and fail miserably. I am confident that as chosen ones, we'll make the right decisions, because you know how we feel about our food. We don't like people messing up our food. But more importantly, we are all aware of the fundamental truth that we all deserve to live with dignity, pursue prosperity in a world of equity and a leveled playing field, not for one community, but for all communities. Thank you.
We're going to open the floor now for questions and answers. And then we will also have some questions in relation to some components of the book, Healing Your Relationship with Money. And we will have now some discussion. The chat is turned on. So if you would like to put it in chat, we would encourage you voicing your question if possible. The floor is now open. But Kara, I'm going to start off with a question I have in regards to thinking about all of the topics you've shared, from environmental issues to wealth and voting to coalitions that make new laws. How can we contextualize that within an economic lens? And can you kind of encapsulate for us, while there are diverse issues there, how are they connected from a financial or economic perspective?
Sure. I think that in terms of being able to have access to resources is at the bottom line what we're looking for. So in terms of an economic perspective, it's being able to understand where are those resources, who holds those resources, and if there are opportunities for us to build partnerships around sharing of resources, being able to mine these resources together, we'll be able to have a network of what they call a hub of support that allows us to make inroads in those various areas. So say, for example, in terms of being able on campus, for example, to position students to, I'm not sure, do you guys have work study here? So being able to create coalitions with those in the Office of Student Employment to ensure that students are actually aware of those resources, when they can apply, the positions that pay the most, and making sure that there are always representatives there that can share when and how to take advantage of these opportunities is one small way that can happen on campus. I think also the college to community connection is a great way to begin to think about what are some ways that they can leverage the resources that they have as students to begin to support the larger Laverne community. Are there ways that they can support instruction at a local school? Are there ways that they can somehow be a part of the city council, if there is one in your community, to begin to, same things that we talked about in our conversation, where the money is, where the political power is to put ourselves in positions to be a part of the conversations and the decision making, and then be able to continuously organize ourselves around that. And those, when you're able to coalition in that way, you're able to make decisions that think about the whole, the voices that aren't heard, the voices on the margin, and being able to do so in a systematic way.
Kara, is it okay if I take your screen share down so we can see everybody?
Oh, sorry.
I can do it. I'll do it.
Okay.
That way, if anybody wants to unmute and ask anything, they can.
There's a comment in the chat from Yvette. Yvette, do you want to share your comment?
I was just offering a resource that kind of reinforces what Ms. Kara was saying about the economic impacts. Nzinga's book on lean semesters really talked about the economic positioning of Black women coming to higher ed with more debt and being underpaid and the wealth gap, and basically how higher education kind of reproduces those inequities. So I was just offering it as a resource.
Thank you. And Kara, we've had some discussions in regards to gender and impact of roles and how gender across our student population, for example, students who maybe don't live on campus because they have commitments at home and as caregivers and roles that are sometimes in competition with being a student and fully focusing, and that disadvantage and how that can cultivate some of their stories.
I missed that part. Was there a question?
No, I was just saying that kind of fits in some of the context of what you were saying with regard to gender dynamics.
For sure. And I think that those conversations can still happen on campus if there are resources that support this transcultural, or a lot of times as first gen students, we are straddling two cultures where on the one hand, you are expected to maintain some cultural norms that may traditionally be rooted in patriarchy, but at the same time be expected to excel educationally, but then still you can't exceed too far out of the community. So having those conversations of what that could possibly look like, well, what does an educated woman look like at this time with these expectations of their family? Are there ways that we can transcend that? Are there things that we can do and role reversals or resource reallocation, or questions of at this time, especially if we're pursuing greater wellness, what role does this level of economics play in purchasing support? Because a lot of those times, those gender roles were created because of economic constraints. But now that there is an economic constraint, what can be replaced? How can we use our resources to create smaller microeconomies that support us and we support, while also making use of the education that, what was the point of it to get it to do some of the same things that historically were done because of a lack of resources and a lack of education? And so those questions have to be posed as well. Why am I doing the same thing my mom didn't want me to do, but now it's expected when I have more education and I can pay someone else to do, or I can just someone else can do it, or I can eliminate it completely. And that goes with the majority of the emotional labor and childcare issues that comes with being an educated woman of color.
You talked a little bit from a macro lens. I'd like to take it down just a little bit to a micro level perspective, because your book, Healing Your Relationship with Money, really gives a practical approach So when we think from the macro lens and all that's happening globally and around us, there are lots of things creating access or not for communities of color. So then how do we begin to, from an individual perspective or at that micro level, develop better understanding of our own money stories so that we can make better connections even despite what's happening at the larger level?
Right. Well, I think part of that is understanding that though your money story is your unique story, it's directly related to the economic, geopolitical circumstances of your time and your parents' time. And so that can offer some comfort because there's clearly a solution in the room if so many of us have experienced it. So that's the first thing. And I would say the second thing is after that awareness is filling in the holes and the gaps in your knowledge base. And the filling in of gaps of your knowledge base can be something very small. I'm a very practical person myself. So I often think about what's my preferred way of learning? And you guys are in college, so you may decide that lecture is your best way, or you like reading shorter articles, or you prefer to learn through listening to something. So podcasts are out there that you can just find leaders in this world that put things in relatable, digestible nuggets for you to understand. There are blogs that you can find. I can leave a number of resources. There's Journey to Launch, which is done by a woman named Jamila Souffront. Is Yo Quiero Dinero. I think she's a Dominican woman that leads specifically around investing in small business. For those of us that want to hear from a voice with that's similar to ours, Jamila Souffront is a Jamaican immigrant and has created, as born of a single mom, and she has created a podcast and a series of workshops and also resources that can help you identify with her experience and then lead you toward practical supports for how do you start a budget when you feel like you don't have any money, or how do you begin to think about investing as a young person. So I would say, practically speaking, at the micro level, deciding even with your schedule, which days would you decide to begin to think about your finances? Would it be Finance Friday that you sit down by yourself, or you sit with a friend and you begin to think about, well, what are our money goals for the next year? And break it down even further. Well, if my goal, say, for example, is to begin investing or thinking about a home or getting out of student loan debt, what does that mean every month? And with every month, what does that mean every week? And you'd be surprised that those small benchmarks, when you're able to concretely break them down into 1 or 2 steps, allows you to build the momentum for you to move forward, but then ultimately reach your goal.
So for the lecture, we really thought about economic well-being kind of in the context of the conversation about human rights and what it means to be free. Can you talk a little bit about how you may have come to creating the book? What was your journey, and what freedoms has having a better relationship with money enacted for you?
Well, I would say that the aspect of humanity that comes with a healthier relationship with money is that first you understand the limits of money. That's one. And you also understand the benefits of money. And what I mean by that is that money can't replace people, but money does offer options for healthcare, for childcare, for opportunities of educational advancement, for rest, for resources. So the whole process of creating the book and coming to this understanding was that how our society has positioned profit above everything has really warped the purpose of money, which is supposed to be a tool to support transactions, to support well-being. And also, there's studies that show that after someone makes $75,000, the diminishing returns of more money starts to happen. And when I say diminishing returns, you make $1 million, you're not necessarily happier than a person that has $75,000. It serves a different purpose, which is possibly status or to create, envy for someone else. And so in the whole process, and to take it back to the idea of humanity, money can humanize situations that are inhumane. Running water creates humane situations so people can actually have the space, the wherewithal, and the well-being to pursue their dreams. Have your basic necessities be met. But what I found with my relationship with money was that if I wasn't able to identify the focus of money for me at certain times in my life, I would always be chasing after it. It would always be a goal of mine to have more of it without any intention or any purpose or any why behind it. And I think for a lot of us in our society, we want money, but we don't really know why we want money, other than to have more of it. But I think, generally speaking, our society has created a scarcity, that the only way that you do have options is if you're uber wealthy. And I'm talking about pentamillionaires. And you can't blame anybody. You can't blame people who pursue money recklessly almost, because it's almost as if we look at corporations that put profits before people's well-being and health, that will raise prices of medicine that people need, knowing that they can't pay for it just for profit, just because they can. It's a parallel between what at the micro level people do. They'll steal, someone may say, it's not right that someone broke into this business and stole this hairdresser's makeup or whatever it is. But in the same vein, we have corporations that steal in their own way. And we just say that's just part of the game. That's just part of business. So to go back to your question of, I don't fault the behaviors at time because it's almost in the air that we breathe. But I think as coalitions and the responsibility of all of us as citizens and active citizens and participants of our society is to question, where are we going in terms of our relationship with money as a society? And that book doesn't speak to the larger lens of the macro to that extent, but I think it does shed light on, if I'm feeling this way about money, where were the external factors that contributed to it? What about the economy or the time that I was raised or the time that my mom was raised contributed to my beliefs around money? And once we're able to start pointing to those things and connecting dots around those influential factors, we'll be able to decide how we can move forward as a society. I hope that answered your question, because I know I went left and right, but I hope I came back to the middle.
Oh, thank you. Are there any questions from the audience?
Hi, Dr. Matthews. I have a question.
Go ahead, Melissa, go ahead.
Hi, Ms. Stevens. How are you?
I'm good, Ms. Moss.
Good. Thank you for being here with us. First and foremost, thank you for the reminder of the rest and the time for yourself. Simply because your plate gets overwhelmed, and just keep going, and don't stop. And sometimes when you do stop, there's not much more left of you. And none of us deserve to live that kind of life.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that reminder.
I'm glad. Thank you.
The question that I have for you is, in your sharing, you had mentioned when you were in college and the resources came up and you had the contention with your roommate who was Korean American. Was there something that you wish that the college community, like your faculty or the college staff, would have helped to kind of build that bridge or have different conversations so you all understood that the resources could be shared, and really how to help develop you all that way towards coalition in a way that wouldn't have the contention that you had to face with your roommate that week?
For sure. I mean, I think that's the whole point of the story, is that I think those things are very much manufactured and for a reason. So in this case, it was an Asian American contention against an African American contention, but sometimes it's Latinos against Blacks. It's sometimes you just mix it all up. And I think that has always been a strategy, is you put the solution on the people who have the least power, not just being Latin or in this case, being for or against a particular course, but being students, honestly, that are just learning about getting along with others. The administration was in the best position to find the money, or conversations about how can the money be found. I think that ultimately that was just done because I didn't want to have to deal with perhaps having conversations on the upper level about getting resources and looking at redundancies in spending in other areas to earmark it for students. Or, depending on the administration may not have been pro-student at that time. And just being able to see those complexities and finding allies in the faculty to say, this is exactly what's happening, or here's exactly what you can do. That would have been great, because we would have had different conversations. But ultimately, students protested, which is our way of being able to get what we want. And ultimately, both communities were able to get their resources, but it didn't have to be that way as an ultimatum. It could have been done from the beginning, saying that there are enough resources, here's what we can do. Or come together with a coalition of students to sit down and think about, what are our goals for each department? What does each department need? Survey the students, get an idea of what is really needed before just pinning it as an issue of, we don't have, this is how much we have, you guys figure it out. It was completely unfair, and it was an imbalance of power to begin with.
Well, I think some of what's really interesting, even in the book, as well as in your response, is this idea that, again, we think sometimes fiscal decision-making is solely about the money. It is far more than that. It's about the relationships of the groups. It's about the outcome and how it impacts the whole community. I mean, there are layers. And so we have to broaden that lens. With that said, one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book was this idea of a 4-week opportunity. Time and process was embedded in the book to kind of learn and grow and think about your relationship to money. But it cued a lot of mental health and well-being kind of practices. Can you speak to us about, was that your intention when you began the book, that it was really it seemed to me at times more a journey about my wellness than just my money? Was that always at the forefront for you, or did that just come as by virtue of how you learned to deal with money over time? Can you speak a little bit about that piece?
I would say that for me, after I shared in our smaller group my time with therapy and my particular advocacy of therapy, that thinking about my thinking and thinking about how I feel about my thinking has become an integral part of how I problem solve. And so that is no different than when I think about money. So in the book, there are, and also as a former teacher that loves a good lesson plan that has a beginning, middle, and an end, and a takeaway for the next day of learning, those influences help create that. I find myself to be a person that is equal parts spiritual, practical. And so with those two lenses of having been the student of a therapist, and using the strategies used for me, and then being the leader of a community of people that come to me for support, I found that combining my years as a pedagogue, my years as a client of someone that had to get support for self-care, that these were the most salient tips and strategies that help people move forward in their relationship to money quickly. And it's been for not just individuals, it's been for couples that can read the book and find a sense of common language to talk about money and talk about their childhoods and talk about who, though it may be that person standing in front of them, which identity or iteration of that person is really speaking. Is it the 5-year-old self? Is it the 12-year-old self that's standing in front of you speaking about their desires or unmet desires? And being able to lay blame to the side and really understand and be receptive to what the subtext is of those requests. Yeah.
Or are there any questions from the audience? I do have one more question before we go, if not.
I had a question I'd
ahead.
like to ask of the speaker. I enjoyed the talk. And early in the talk, you talked about disparities and how COVID affected different communities. I just wonder, how can we share that information more effectively, in that, you know, people are not necessarily aware of how other people are affected by the things that affect them. You really have to look at the statistics. You really have to be aware. And I was just wondering if you had any advice for how to make people aware of these disparities that that are real and that we see through statistics.
I think I'm going to give you my take off my speaker hat and put on my social media influencer hat for a minute. I think there's a place for the line between education and entertainment that gets people to pay attention, because we're looking and we're fighting for a lot of people's attention in this very compact, in this world that requires us to fight for it. And so I would say, and I'm not saying this jokingly, I would say small bits of information at first to create something that matters to them and link it to that topic. So numbers, for those of us that are academics and really interested in the data, those things are important, but stories are the ones that really matter the most. When I was doing the research for this keynote, there were so many stories of families who lost their uncles, lost a whole generation in one household. And I think it sobers you when you hear those stories. When you just take away, forget about the Stanford-led study, that appeals to a certain type of learner, those that are very information-dense readers. But for most of us, hearing that I lost my grandmother and my mother and my father, we became homeless, or I couldn't pay and afford rent, those are the stories. And sharing those stories and then offering the data as a second piece to get them to understand that, I think is the best way. And I think also images similar to stories really can lead to people really consuming that information without feeling overwhelmed by it.
Thank you.
So with that question, Kara, I'm going to say on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences and the University of Laverne, thank you for such a fruitful conversation. I think whether at the macro level or the micro level, we have to understand that economic issues, political issues, lived experiences are intertwined and interconnected. And really, to broaden the conversation, we can't miss that connection. So thank you for that. And before we go, I will let Dr. Lieberman, who is our president, say final words, and then we'll say goodbye to the audience.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's 1 o'clock. Final words. Thank you very much, Dr. Stevens. That was, I had a zillion questions. I'll follow up with you by email. I didn't want to take any time from anybody else. But the message that you brought to us is the message that we need to hear, and not just hear, but also put into action. So thank you so much. And Dean Matthews, thank you. Thank you for giving me that little 30 seconds there. I appreciate that. I think everybody who was on this session really gained something, maybe separately, but quality. And the book is a must read. Thank you so much.
And if you're interested in the book, we're going to stay on so you can hear more about it or talk to Kara about that. We do have some copies in our office as well that have been signed. So we can communicate information about that also. If you'd like to hear more about the book, please stay on.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.